Okay, good morning. Today is Friday the 13th, 2023. This is the meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are taking up Bill S5, an act relating to affordably meeting mandated greenhouse gas reductions for the thermal sector through electrification, decarbonization, efficiency, and weatherization measures. So we will be doing a literal line-by-line read-through of the bill. We've allocated the whole morning to it. If we need, this is one of those, a friend, Bill Grace, and one of the things he would say is, we have so much to do, we really have to slow down. And I feel like that's one of those, this is one of those moments, like there's a lot of information. Bill will go at whatever pace we need to really feel like we have a really thorough walkthrough. I figure there will be questions that will come up, and we might be able to answer them on the fly. Some of them we'll just flag and say, I already know one for myself, you know, like I would like to get some testimony so I better understand just what this will really mean, you know, the way it would play out. So with that, Ms. Chakowski, please take us on a tour of S5.
Are you gonna, excuse me, are you gonna do the timeline or the bill first?
I'm gonna start with the bill. I don't think you need to put it up on the screen unless they want it to, because
All the people at home.
Good morning, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Today we're going through S5. It is on your website posted for today, as well as a timeline I've provided that we will talk about at the end. Senator Bray, do you want to introduce
Sure.
the bill? Is it?
Yeah, thanks. Right. I think everyone in the committee has heard plenty, but if someone's tuning in, Vermont has, we passed laws to say that we, in order to respond responsibly to the challenges of climate change, we need to respond to the drivers of that climate change. And fundamentally, the driver of climate change is greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the straightforward physics of it. So how can we reduce those emissions? If you look at, we need to reduce emissions, and then if you look at all the emissions in the state of Vermont, the top three are, number one, transportation at about 40%, heating at around 34%, and agriculture at about 16%. So we heard briefly yesterday from the Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources about plans related to all three sectors. S5 is the Senate's effort to address thermal sector emissions and to reduce greenhouse gases through a variety of measures. And S5 just explains how we're going to do that. So, you know, and I would say one last thing: the reduction requirements are requirements by law, and we have, as lawmakers, we're also law followers, I hope, and so we're doing our best to follow that law and come up with a program that meets its requirements. The question in my mind is, how do we do it in the most affordable and advantageous way for Vermonters, and especially for people with low and moderate incomes, for whom the energy burden, total energy spending in their household, is particularly high. The last framing remark I'd say is that we're the second winter of record high fuel prices, and that is leaving a lot of families in a stressed position, critical positions. In the last year, I've asked people about how it's going with heat, you know, because the conversations we all have when you're out and about, grocery store, whatever, on the street, post office, and people have said they're spending between $2,000 and $4,000 more now than they were like 2 winters ago. So that is a huge hit in a state where median incomes are around $60,000 a year for a family or a household. So that this is our strategy for how to address that.
Do you want to mention anything about 715? Or should I?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say something short, and you can say something more and precise. there was a bill last year, H715, referred to as the Clean Heat Standard. It passed both House and Senate. It was vetoed by the governor. The legislature failed to override that veto. 715 was this, when I talked to Mr. Kowski back in the summer, I said, well, let's start with 715 as it passed, the two bodies, and work from there. And there has been an ongoing working group for 2+ years, hosted at the Energy Action Network, with I'd say a dozen or more, maybe a dozen active regular participants, but the group that has been looking at a way to have a clean heat sector is probably totals 40 or 50 people. So there's been a wide, a think tank at work on this outside the building, which has been very helpful to us because it has, there's a lot of expertise in that group. They provided edits to Mr. Kowski and me and others over the summer and fall. By the time this bill was introduced, it's draft 1 for us, but in the committee room, we were already at draft 8.1 by the time it came over. So there's been a lot of background work.
Just go over again, who is that committee?
So Energy Action Network has funding enough to provide logistical support to create work groups on issues that are actually at their annual meeting. Different people make presentations on what they would like to work on, sort of like a research grant competition. And 2+ years ago, one of the winning proposals was figuring out how to have a clean heat sector or reducing thermal emissions. And that that working group was sort of the think tank behind last year's 715, and they've continued to meet and help us refine the version that's in front of us now, S5. The other thing I'd say is that we listened carefully to concerns expressed sort of from right and left on H715, and this bill attempts to address many of the concerns and criticisms we've heard. If we hit the target exactly, we'll find out as we work through it together and take more testimony. So thanks for the reminder to provide a little context for what we're going to walk through. You want to introduce it anymore yourself?
Sure, I would just further add that H715 was the base of this bill, and I'm going to highlight the areas of this bill that are brand new. There are a few new big concepts and then a lot of grammar and sort of style rearranging the bill. So I'm going to highlight the big new concepts, the couple of concepts that are new. They're not that big, but there are a couple of additions to this bill that were not in H715 at all. And so I don't know if that will be helpful for members of the committee, because you don't want to necessarily focus on 715, but some of you are very familiar with that bill. So a lot of this will sound familiar.
Are you focusing on the governor's objections?
Can you say that again?
I was like, how much of this rewrite is responsive to the governor's objections in his veto letter?
I think that's a question for the sponsor.
Well, that's part of why we went through the message yesterday. As I said, I think yesterday, my dad always said, a good idea can come from anywhere. So Secretary Moore said she raised some concerns on behalf of the administration. We've heard they were familiar. So I think, for instance, affordability, I would say, if you had to paint one bucket, it's the affordability bucket. Can we afford this? Which I'd say two things. One, I would argue the current system is unaffordable. This is the one that is stressing people out. And that, from a financial perspective, I also feel like the current system fails to meet the requirements of our law. And I can't reconcile those two, that we're just going to ignore the requirement. So, but Secretary Moore also said she wasn't interested just in criticizing our work, that she'd come back with positive proposals, so I really appreciate that attitude. I don't know if we get to a yes for the governor or not. It'd be great if we did, but I think we'll just do our own best work. I think we've kept those criticisms in mind and made a genuine effort to improve them. Maybe we'll make some further refinements as we go. I'm sure we'll make further refinements. Question is what between here and the finish line? And I'd say last thing, finish line is we're pretty up tempo on this, and I would hope that by something like the third, fourth week of February, we're all done and we've sorted it out.
Great. So I'll start on page 1. The short title of this bill, the act shall be known and may be cited as the Affordable Heat Act. Section 2 is the findings section. And these findings are nearly identical to last year's bill, but I'll read through them for you, starting on page 2. The General Assembly finds all of the legislative findings made in the 2020 Acts and Resolves, number 153, section 2, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2020, remain true and are incorporated by reference here. Under the GWSA and 10 VSA 578, Vermont has a legal obligation to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to specific levels by 2025, 2030, and 2050. The Vermont Climate Council was established under the GWSA and was tasked with, among other things, recommending necessary legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The initial Vermont Climate Action Plan calls for the General Assembly to adopt legislation authorizing the Public Utility Commission to administer the Clean Heat Standard consistent with the recommendations of the Energy Action Network's Clean Heat Standard Working Group. As required by the GWSA, the Vermont Climate Council published the initial Vermont Climate Action Plan on December 1, 2021. As noted in that plan, over 1/3 of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions in 2018 came from the thermal sector. In that year, approximately 72% of Vermont's thermal energy use was fossil-based, including 29% from the burning of heating oil, 24% from fossil gas, and 19% from propane. To meet the greenhouse gas emission reductions required by the GWSA, Vermont needs to transition away from its current carbon-intensive building heating practices to lower carbon alternatives. It also needs to do this equitably, recognizing economic effects on energy users, especially energy burdened users, on the workforce currently providing these services, and on the overall economy. All right, so section 3 is the main section of this bill. So I'm on page 3, starting on line 8. This establishes chapter 94 in title 30. And these are going to be all the statutory provisions related to the Clean Heat Standard. So first is new section 8121, the intent section. This language was in H715 last year. It was the last section of the statutory section. And it is an intent section, and largely this will be related to LCAR's work in reviewing the rules. So it is the intent of the General Assembly that the Clean Heat Standard be designed and implemented in a way that achieves Vermont's thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions reductions necessary to meet the requirements of 10 VSA 578A. Maximize costs to minimize costs to customers, and recognizes that affordable heating is essential for Vermonters. It shall minimize adverse impacts to customers with low income and moderate income, and those households with the highest energy burdens.
So we'll come back and take some testimony on energy burden. There have been a number of studies that help spell out the picture. What do we mean by that term, and how does it play out from the state? Different regions have different energy profiles.
And as I just mentioned, where we're headed at the end of this bill is that the PUC is going to be directed to adopt rules with the further details of the Clean Heat Standard. And as part of the rulemaking process, rules are reviewed by the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, known as LCAR. One of the things LCAR reviews for is whether or not the rules conform to legislative intent. And so this was added last year, I think, to make sure there was a clear statement of the intent for El Cartel.
Thank you. Yeah, Senator McDowell and I both serve on it, and one of the things that can be difficult to discern is what was legislative intent. So rather than having that committee fish around for it, let's be explicit.
All right, line 16 on page 3, clean heat standard 8122. The clean heat standard is established. Under this program, obligated parties shall reduce greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the Vermont thermal sector by retiring required amounts of clean heat credits to meet the thermal sector portion of the greenhouse gas emission reduction obligations of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think this is one of the sentences that sums up the whole bill. This is the sort of primary objective being laid out. Page 4. Top of page 4, line 1. By rule or order, the commission shall establish or adopt a system of tradable clean heat credits earned from the delivery of clean heat measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So as I just said on the previous page, the way that the parties are going to meet their obligation is by retiring clean heat credits. Currently, clean heat credits do not exist. That's not a type of credit that's currently generated. So the PUC is going to have to establish a system for recognizing what things generate credits. And there will be more detail on this in a later section. C, an obligated party may obtain the required amount of clean heat credits through delivery of eligible clean heat measures, through contracts for delivery of eligible clean heat measures, through the market purchase of clean heat credits, or through delivery of eligible clean heat measures by a designated statewide default delivery agent. So many of the words in that section I just read are going to be defined in the next section, so we can talk about them more in depth. And D, the Public Utility Commission shall adopt rules and may issue orders to implement the Clean Heat Standards program.
Senator.
Thank you, Chairman Bright. Just to, even if this is not how you want to run this line by line, let me know. I'm just wondering, the shall adopt rules and may issue orders, if you could talk a little bit about the distinction there.
Sure. So the Public Utility Commission is a quasi-judicial body, and so they have some of the powers of administrative agency, but they also have some of the powers of a court. So they do currently issue rules in order to oversee some of the programs they run. Typically, when you hear about agencies adopting procedures, you're usually talking about rules, which is a very formal defined process and statute under the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act. And it's very rigid structure that the agency has to follow. The Public Utility Commission often also uses something called orders, which are like rules. They are a procedural document that people can follow as part of the overall requirements from the agency. But it's much more informal compared to rulemaking, as there's no statutory procedure for it. The PUC does have their own internal procedure for it, where they open a docket on their website so that people can follow what is happening in the development of the order, as well as provide comments. But it's a significantly less rigid and more informal system than rulemaking. So yeah, go.
Senator.
Which means when you direct them and when you do orders, you're giving them more free rein to do what they want to do and less guidance. You're just ceding to them, making lawful announcements that everyone has to follow. It's a big change in the surrender of our job, which is to pass laws. That's editorial.
And I'll supplement that editorial because from my perspective, it's important that we're putting in the bill, it became obvious while we worked our way through, there's a great deal of direction to that, but there are areas where they're going to be doing analysis, for instance, or there are areas where flexibility in how they actually carry out the work, I think, is, and in a timely way, it's aggressive timeline to do all the work, that we give them the flexibility of using orders. But I'll, want to stick to the fact that there's a very rigid framework in which they're going to operate overall.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. I read this section and it feels more like a nice Arnold Palmer of options for the PUC, where we give them a little bit of tea, but we also give them some flexibility. So I actually think it's a nice mix of an opportunity for them.
Depends on the result. We've had our battles with PUC where they have issued orders that we believed were not lawful. I think people generally agreed with us, but the consequence of trying to undo what they had done was complicated and disruptive. So the orders ended up that they gave illegally went through because it was too much of a hassle to undo them. That's my view of history.
We will have we'll have Ms. Dexter Cooper in to help us spend a little time on the APA, to burn right down into it, make sure that we can have that piece of it straight. And then also the PUC will spend a fair amount of time with us. But so I'm acknowledging what you're saying, and I think having been through that experience, I think we want to grant that flexibility to use orders within a well-controlled framework so that we maintain both our authority and our responsibility.
Which is a difficult needle to thread.
And I would say this committee does a lot of legal.
We sit on pins and needles.
Yeah.
So as I was driving in this morning, having listened to yesterday's testimony, often we get a side-by-side, like the legislative plan to bring people's, change how they heat their home and make it, more affordable and less polluting. If you would have had to put a side-by-side together in the next 24 hours, what would the administration's side of the chart say?
Genuinely don't know.
Well, Mr. Chair, we got a problem. The administration says they share our goals, and when we go to do a side-by-side, we have no clue.
Okay, so noted.
Hoping we can continue.
Yes.
Okay.
I would add one more thing, lest we could just ice for more questions, but I do think that overall there are pros and cons to deciding whether or not to use rules or orders, at least initially. So I think that that is something that legislature considered last year. There are pros and cons to each. I know that this committee has strong feelings about rules. So it is shall adopt rules and may issue orders. All right, definitions are the next section, 8123. So the first definition is a new definition. It's carbon intensity value. The carbon intensity value means the amount of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions per unit of energy of fuel expressed in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. This definition is going to be used as part of one of the new concepts in this bill, which is about reducing the carbon intensity of biofuels. Number two is the definition of clean.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Because I don't know that we all talk about joules regularly, although Senator Watson does.
Yeah,
So maybe you want to just sort of unpack that, turn that into a user-friendly definition.
Oh.
Energy per unit of work or whatever it turns out to be.
Sure, well, so I guess, in terms of, you just want to do about joules or explaining joules?
Yeah,
That'd be good.
because
Okay.
most people don't talk about joules.
Yeah, sure, so a joule is a unit of energy. You could think about it as like how many calories you burn, same kind of thing, calories, just a different unit for energy. So we could talk about like how many calories are in a joule or joules are in a calorie. So, you know, like you run up the stairs and like, yeah, that you burned energy. Like you burned some calories to do that work. And yeah, a megajoule is quite a bit.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Yes. It's not, that, I could give you more user-friendly.
Oh, that's
answer.
great. I just, you know,
Okay.
it's not a term we often use in the building, so I wanted to just slow down and say, what is it? So if someone went, any of us will mention voting on this, and says, what's a joule? And we can say, well, it's a unit of energy. And this is how much emissions are entailed by producing that unit of energy.
How many calories?
I think it's like 4 point something, but let me look that up real quick. That's okay.
Sure.
That's like chemistry.
Sir, Sarah,
Sheets.
When we passed the clean heat bill last year, one of the criticisms was that biofuels did not measure the actual amount of carbon that were employed in growing, processing, and delivering biofuels for use. And the bill that we passed set up an independent system for evaluating and measuring those various inputs that went into creating biofuels, so that you had a full accounting of joules, right? Of joules that were used to produce the fuel that's also measured in joules. And, that was in the bill. Wasn't acknowledged, and it was sometimes, unless to say it was too complicated to understand.
and it's remains in the bill with some further refining language. Thank you, Sarah. Now,
All right, so clean heat credits, number 2, are a tradable, non-tangible commodity that represents the amount of greenhouse gas reduction attributable to a clean heat measure. The commission shall establish a system of management for clean heat credits pursuant to this chapter. There will be a lot more discussion on this concept, but I think it's fair to think of it as similar to a renewable energy credit, but for a different type of thing entirely. So clean heat measure means fuel and technologies delivered and installed to end users in Vermont that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Clean heat measure shall not include switching from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel. The commission may adopt a list of acceptable actions that qualify as clean heat measures. And so again, there is going to be a whole section on in depth more about clean heat measures and what will count as clean heat measures. But this is just setting out the definition.
and you know, I'll just flag that clean measures shall not include switching from one using one fossil fuel to another. The point is to, because investments, for instance, in heating appliances are long lived, and we're trying to set ourselves up for reductions. And it's not helpful to make a commitment, a long life commitment to use of yet another fossil fuel. So that's why that is explicit here.
Just a question about procedure. Would, if we, so I got to go through this, the fine comb yesterday. And so if I had suggestions, is now the time, or maybe perhaps that's for a future time? So it's just.
Thanks for asking that question. So my suggestion, just so that we have a sense of the whole,
Yeah.
is that we flag things.
Yeah.
And maybe you want to briefly say what it is you're flagging, so we keep it in mind too. And then we will certainly come back to every issue that you want to flag.
Sure. Well, so just to, not getting really into it right now, but just thinking about, switching from one fossil fuel to another. Wondering if that means that it is allowable to install equipment that it would be okay to go from the same fossil fuel to the same fossil fuel if it just reduced.
It's get more efficient.
Right. Anyway, Not something we have to talk about now,
Okay.
just flag it.
So it's kind of like, what about switching within the same fuel?
Yes.
Well, I understand this, correct. This is more having to do with the argument, for example, for natural gas, is that it's a fossil fuel, but it's less polluting, but.
Or, like, I think it could be any number of things that's just more efficient.
Yes.
Anyway, to be continued.
And I think part of it is the whole notion of switching as opposed to staying. So thank you for that. Okay.
All right, so line 4 on page 5. The commission refers to the Public Utility Commission. Default delivery agent means the entity designated by the commission to provide services that generate clean heat measures. There is a whole section on this as well later, so we can talk about it more. Energy burden means the annual spending on thermal energy as a percentage of household income. Entity means any individual, trustee, agency, partnership, association, corporation, company, municipality, political subdivision, or any other form of organization. Fuel pathway, so this is the other new definition that's in here, means a detailed description of all stages of fuel production and use for any particular fuel, including feedstock generation or extraction, production, transportation, distribution, and combustion of the fuel by the consumer. The fuel pathway is used in the calculation of the carbon intensity value and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of each fuel.
So turning down to your earlier point about full accounting, this definition gets introduced to help set us up better for that analysis.
Okay, heating fuel means fossil-based heating fuel, including oil, propane, natural gas, coal, and kerosene. Obligated party means a regulated natural gas utility serving customers in Vermont, or top of page 6, for other heating fuels, the entity that makes the first sale of the heating fuel into or in the state for consumption within the state. This is one of the big concepts of this bill that we'll discuss a little bit farther down, but these are the people who are going to need to comply with the credit requirements that represent them reducing their greenhouse gas emissions.
And one quick note on this one, so we'll have Matt Coda in, as clearly because he represents Vermont Fuel Dealers for that conversation, but also I asked him to help us better understand the supply chain for fuels. So we'll can unpack and make sure that this was one of the things I wanted to, for myself. I felt like, okay, let's really dot the i's, cross the t's. And there's different ways fuel gets into Vermont, and we want to make sure that the description here names accurately the appropriate parties.
Yeah, and so Vermont doesn't extract any fossil fuels. So all fossil fuels that we use in the state were produced somewhere else and need to enter the state. All right, thermal sector is the last definition. It has the same meaning as the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector as used in the Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast. So reference to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast happens sort of throughout this. It's one of the major tools that relates to this bill, and so I think we all know when I say what thermal sector means, but this is clearly tying it to how the greenhouse gas inventory uses that phrase.
And we just received a report on updates on the greenhouse gas. Oh, I'm sorry. When I'm misspeaking, we got a Reggie report. When we back that up, then we'll follow up on the other emissions report.
Yeah, I think you heard yesterday that they're not
Right.
due anytime. They're not
Yeah.
coming out
Until
until
the summer.
a few months,
The
yeah.
next update.
So 8124 is clean heat standard compliance. This is one of the longest sections of this bill because it really lays out the elements of the program. So required amounts. The commission shall establish the number of clean heat credits that each obligated party is required to retire each calendar year. The size of the annual requirement shall be set at a pace sufficient for Vermont's thermal sector to achieve life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent emission reductions consistent with the requirements of 10 BSA 578A, expressed as a life cycle greenhouse gas emission pursuant to 8125F, this title, which is later in this section. So this is like one of the primary sections here. Obligated parties are going to need to reduce their emissions every year and represent that by supplying greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to need to represent that by supplying clean heat credits. The amount of the reduction every year is going to be set, is going to be tied to what's required in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that amount is going to be set by the PUC. All right, page 6, line 14. Annual requirements shall be expressed as a percent of each obligated party's contribution to the thermal sector's life cycle CO2e emissions in the previous year, with the annual percentages being the same for all obligated parties. To ensure understanding among obligated parties, the PUC shall publicly provide a description of the annual requirements in plain terms. Obligated parties are going to sell a certain amount of fuel each year in Vermont. Based on their prior year's sale, they're going to need to reduce a certain percent of that to meet the requirements each year. And that's what they'll need to provide credits to demonstrate. To support the ability of the obligated parties to plan for the future, the Commission shall establish and update annual clean heat credit requirements for the next 10 years. Every 3 years, the Commission shall extend the requirements 3 years, shall assess emission reductions actually achieved in the thermal sector, and if necessary, revise the pace of clean heat credit for future years to ensure that thermal sector portion of the emissions reduction requirement of 578 for 2030 and 2050 will be achieved. So this program is a performance standard very similar to the Renewable Energy Standard. Under the Renewable Energy Standard, utilities are required to produce a certain amount of RECs every year, retire a certain amount of RECs every year, demonstrating how much renewable energy they have in their portfolio. And the percentage increases over time on a set schedule. This is very similar in that fuel dealers are going to need to retire clean heat credits, showing that they have made emissions reductions on a percentage schedule that decreases over time. So the PUC will be setting that exact schedule. Page 7, line 6. The Commission may temporarily adjust the annual requirements for good cause after notice and opportunity for public process. Good cause may include a shortage of clean heat credits or undue adverse financial impacts on particular customers or demographic segments. And so hypothetically, this is going to have, the PUC is going to have a schedule published for 10 years worth of requirements. However, if at some point the PUC finds that there's a problem, if there's a significant issue in the economy, if there's a supply chain issue again where there's a shortage of clean heat credits, they do have the opportunity here to adjust temporarily the requirements.
Yeah, sometimes I call this like the circuit breaker provision. Just laying out a program, we're expecting it to operate in certain parameters, but we don't know the future, so we want to have a provision so that people aren't scrambling to adjust, but that there's already provision that allows adjustments.
Might that be seen as a loophole?
Well, it does require a demonstration of good cause and a hearing, so it's not something they can do in the dark.
With the public process.
I always cringe when language something like where practicable.
We didn't use that word yet.
We struck the word.
So I would just say that one of the bills that you passed last year was an extension of the pilot program for energy savings account, which needed to be extended because all work stopped for over a year on construction. And so if hypothetically that were to happen again, this is a clear, I think that type of situation clearly fits within what is good cause that could happen after a public process. If you'd like to strengthen it, you can.
Just thinking, maybe this is this could be flag and come back to.
Yeah.
I mean, I have some thoughts, but I'm gonna hold on to them.
Okay, line 10, annual registration. Each entity that sells heating fuel into or in Vermont shall register annually with the commission by an annual deadline established by the commission. The form and information required in the registration shall be determined by the commission and shall include all data necessary to establish annual requirements under this chapter. The commission shall use the information provided in the registration to determine whether an entity shall be considered an obligated party and the amount of its annual registration. So this is saying that anyone who sells heating fuel into or into Vermont shall register, and then from that list, the PUC is going to look at the definition of obligated party and make sure all of the fuel sellers who need to be obligated are. At a minimum, the commission shall require registration information to include legal name, doing business as name, if applicable, if applicable, municipality, state, type of heating fuel sold, and the volume of sales of heating fuel into or in the state for final sale or consumption in the state in the calendar year immediately preceding the calendar year in which the entity is registering in the commission. Page 8, line 3, each year and not later than 30 days following the annual registration deadline established by the commission shall share complete registration information of obligated parties with the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Public Service for purposes of conducting the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast and meeting the requirements of 10 VSA 591(b)(3). So I think we heard a little bit yesterday about the need for sharing data, and so this is just one way that we're making sure that ANR and DPS has this sort of more granular data that will be generated by the obligated parties so that it can be added into the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast.
And happily, Secretary Morrison, that resolution of the data issue was weeks away, like a couple of weeks, forthcoming sometime soon. Which we're not.
The commission shall maintain and update annually a list of registered entities on its website that contains the required registration information, except that the public list shall not include heating fuel volumes reported. For any entity not registered, the first registration form shall be due 30 days after the first sale of heating fuel to a location in Vermont.
Perhaps this is something for rulemaking, but is there any penalty that needs to be specified for an entity not registering?
By not complying with this provision, I think inherently you are in violation.
So we don't need to specify.
No, and there's the enforcement section on this is coming up on the next page or 2 pages. So there's enforcement authority.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
That's why there's a shall at the beginning of it, just so you know, there's a shall is a legal requirement.
And implies penalty.
Yeah, and the way that we structure enforcement sections, so like I did go back, we can talk about this again in a few minutes, but the enforcement section here just empowers the PUC to use their Title 30 enforcement powers, and that section in Title 30 does state that a violation of a rule or statute under their control allows them to enforce. So it's sort of, it isn't as specific, and so it is sort of different, I think, than like criminal law.
Yeah. I should think that whatever penalty is in place ought to be enough to make it worthwhile for someone to register. And that's sort of nice.
Sure, so I do think this is one area that would potentially be filled in by rules, but it is something that you could be more specific about.
I don't know that we need to, I just wanted to share that. Okay, thank you.
Right, and, but to your point, there's also, if you're an obligated party and you haven't registered, and now you're out of compliance, now you're gonna be short of 80 credits in a year, and if you haven't delivered those, there is a you're required to pay with a 3x what would have been your normal
Right.
obligations. So there's motivation in terms of it becomes more expensive if you don't participate.
Yeah, well, my worry was like, if someone has not registered
And they're just selling.
and they're just selling, then does that kick in? Or is it, no, you haven't registered and it's even more, because you didn't even, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I wonder just what that rate would be. I think I'm used to like municipal ordinances where we say this is what the penalty is gonna be. Okay.
So I'll add just two things. So first, that's why the provision on the prior page is that anyone who's selling fuel has to register, and that is broader than obligated parties, and that is sort of to get a handle on how many people are actually selling heating fuel in Vermont, because I think that was an open question last year of getting the full universe of who is selling fuel. And some of them may not actually be obligated parties, because you're going to be making a decision here on the chain of on the supply chain, who is the obligated party. And so that's why there is a broader registration requirement. You could be more explicit. And I will say that at the end, at the very end, one of the reporting requirements for the PUC in one of their check bag reports is to recommend if they need additional enforcement authority. Because last year there was conversations about different elements, different other types of elements of enforcement authority that could be useful, but so it is something that you could fill in details, but it is something that at the end the PUC is required to report back on that.
And also, I think, it's worth bringing up the PUC, because we've done other rules with them in the past, and wanted to make sure that they had adequate enforcement authority, and weren't feeling inadequately supported to make the program perfect. So it's a good question. Worth bearing down on when we have the, and the PUC will be over.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I can't remember where I left off, but number 5, I think further slightly addresses this. So for any entity not registered, the first registration form shall be due 30 days after the first sale of heating fuel to a location in Vermont. And so that's setting a clear deadline when that requirement kicks in. So line 15, clean heat requirements shall transfer to entities that acquire an obligated party. Entities that cease to operate shall retain their clean heat requirement for their final year of operation. This is new language from last year, so you may want to take a little more testimony about this. Because this wasn't in the bill last year, but I think it is an interesting issue to think about, which is what happens if someone goes out of business. Do they need to comply with the clean heat standard? And it would be, so anyways.
Or if they're acquired, or they declare bankruptcy, then they're acquired, with the clean heat credit requirement, live for the earlier entity, and then the acquiring entity would say, well, I want to inherit that obligation. So we just wanted to say, if you've made a sale that required a clean heat credit, that obligation lives on.
All right, line 19 on page 8, early action credits, beginning on January 1, 2023, so 2 weeks ago. Clean heat measures that are installed and provide emission reductions are creditable and shall count towards the future clean heat credit requirement of an obligated party. Upon the establishment clean heat credit system, entities may register credits for actions taken starting in 2023.
So because this program, should this bill pass and the rule go into development, people would know that there are clean heat credits that will be available for action. For instance, installing a co-pilot pump. We don't want someone to be discouraged from doing that work right now because they say, well, if I wait 2 years till the program's running, I'll get credits for taking this very same action. So we want to start, we want to account for and recognize the very kind of work that we're trying to encourage through the bill effective this year. So there's no perverse disincentive to act. This one's about.
Additionally, this will create a pool of credits that will be available before the program even starts. And just as a preview, I think that the bill suggests pretty strongly that the clean heat standard would go into effect January 1, 2026. Although it isn't clear the exact start date, but I think the goal in the bill is 2026. So having a pool of credits before the program actually starts. All right, page 9, line 3, equitable distribution of clean heat measures. The clean heat standard shall be designed and implemented to enhance social equity by minimizing adverse impacts on customers with low income and moderate income and those households with the highest energy burdens. The design shall ensure all customers have an equitable opportunity to participate in and benefit from clean heat measures, regardless of heating fuel used, income level, geographic location, or home ownership status. Of the annual requirement, each obligated party shall retire at least 16% from customers with low income and 16% from customers with moderate income. I'm going to stop there for a second. So every year, an obligated party is going to have a set amount of credits they're going to need to generate retire credits to meet their general obligation. Within that, they're going to need to have 32% come from low income and moderate income customers. Starting on line 12, there's a new layer to this that has been added. At least 1/2 of these credits shall be from installed clean heat measures that require capital investments in homes, have measure lives of 10 years or more, and are estimated by the technical advisory group to lower annual energy bills. Examples shall include weatherization improvements and installations of heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, and advanced wood heating systems. The commission may identify additional measures that qualify as installed measures.
So the editorial side on this one is that, there was, as I said, one of the chief concerns presented to us, and I'm sure we actually shared it as well. Like, we want the program to be affordable. So if you were to satisfy a clean heat credit requirement by simply switching to lower, less carbon intense fuels, you would be meeting the letter of the law, but you wouldn't necessarily be helping people save money for the long term. So this says we're going to at least half those credits come from installed measures that require capital investment. So we're looking for investments that yield savings for the long term and not just simple compliance with law in terms of emissions. It is an investment. Everyone, I think we've all seen plenty of data to say that when you invest in clean energy measures, it's always cost effective. The question is over what time span, and so we're trying to help make those investments, which can be costly.
Okay. Line 19. The definitions of customer with low income and customer with moderate income shall be set by the commission in consultation with the Equity Advisory Group and in alignment with other existing definitions.
And that goes back to AMI versus FPL definitions and reconciling those. It gets used in different parts of law in different ways. So we're trying to play nicely with the different definitions that get used, and we'll sort that out over time as opposed to name it as a hard fixed definition here. Subject to further testing.
Very smart.
Page 10. The commission may consider front-loading the credit requirements for customers with low impact, with low income and moderate income so that the greatest proportion of clean heat measures reach Vermonters with low income and moderate income in the earlier years. So this is just giving the PUC an option, because there was discussion about this, whether there should be further restrictions and when and how the customers with low income and moderate income are addressed. Line 5, in order to best serve customers with low income and moderate income, the PUC shall have authority to change the percentages established in subdivision 2 of this subsection and the criteria used to define customers with low income and moderate income for good cause after notice and opportunity for public process. In determining whether to exceed the minimum percentages of clean heat measures that must be delivered to customers with low income and moderate income, the commission shall take into account participation in other government-sponsored low income and moderate income weatherization programs. A clean heat measure delivered to a customer qualifying for a government-sponsored low energy subsidy shall qualify for clean heat credits required under subdivision 2 of this subsection. So this language came out of a discussion last year that, especially with early action credits and the first year of the program, how would obligated parties know who would qualify as low income and moderate income? And this is creating a very bright line of if a customer is eligible for an existing low income energy subsidy, they would qualify under this bill as part of that requirement.
And for years, as we've been trying to develop a bill like this, we've said that it goes hand in glove with weatherization. One reduces the amount of energy needed, the other will clean up the supply of the energy that's provided. So this is yet another effort in the bill to look at them in an integrated way so that we get the biggest bang for the buck.
All right, line 18, credit banking. The commission shall allow an obligated party that has met its annual requirement in a given year to retain clean heat credits in excess of the amount for future sale or application to the obligated party's annual requirements and future compliance needs and future compliance periods as determined by the commission. All right, page 11, line 3, default delivery agent. An obligated party may meet its annual requirements through a designated default delivery agent appointed by the commission. The default delivery agent shall deliver creditable clean heat measures to Vermont homes and businesses when an obligated party chooses to assign its annual requirement to the default delivery agent, or an obligated party fails to produce or acquire its required amounts of clean heat credits as described in subdivision G2, which is the enforcement section. The commission shall designate the default delivery agent. The default delivery agent shall be a single statewide entity capable of providing a variety of clean heat measures and contracted for a multi-year period through competitive procurement process. The entity selected as the default delivery agent may also be a market participant, but shall not be an obligated party. So let me just play that back.
Center one.
I'm just hoping we can get clarification on what that means.
So what's going to happen is that at the start of all this, the PUC is going to designate a default delivery agent. They are going, and there's a few more details as we go farther, but they're going to be someone who does clean heat work, either weatherization work, installing heat pumps, that type of work. That entity will be sort of the reserve entity, and an obligated party can either choose to generate and get their own credits, or they can go to the designated default delivery agent and say, I don't have the bandwidth to generate credits, can please generate credits on my behalf that count for me. And so they will need to pay the delivery agent. There's, as we continue, there's a statutory way that the PUC is gonna set the price to be paid. And this is gonna sort of act as a backstop, as a sort of a measure of not necessarily last resort, but like a perpetual option for obligated parties so that they don't necessarily have to do their own work, or if they can't find credits on the market to purchase, there will be an entity that does work to generate credits that they can pay for. In addition, anyone who violates this provision and gets an enforcement penalty, that enforcement penalty will go additionally to work to be done, so that there will be an entity who's being paid by the state fairly regularly to continue to do weatherization and clean heat work.
Could you give an example of what a type of organization like that might be? Not to, I think I see what you might be describing as the organization that may become that obligated party.
So I'll jump in with a model in mind.
Yes.
You know. So it reminds me a little of the history of electric, the distribution utilities, the electric companies that all had an obligation to deliver energy efficiency work. Before there was Efficiency Vermont, they all had to do it on their own. And at that point, I think we had 27 utilities in the state. Now we're down to something like 17. And a lot of them were small municipals, things like that. And they found it burdensome to try to figure out how to create an energy efficiency program. So they said, well, then Efficiency Vermont was for a statewide energy efficiency utility was created. And you could say, I'm going to meet my obligation through working through Efficiency Vermont. But in my mind, at least, that's a model for this kind of construct. You could say, I'm in the fuel business. I don't want to figure this out. I know I have an obligation. I'm willing to meet it. I'm going to go to the statewide default delivery agent, and I'm just going to get my credits there.
Thank you, that's what I was understanding.
Just a simple suggestion, wondering if we could move section 2 that sort of defines the designated delivery agent higher up, perhaps just under to number 1, because I think anybody who's reading through this is going to be potentially like, what is a default delivery agent? And so having that first.
Yeah, as I was reading it, that did occur to me too. I'm open to that suggestion, so I defer to, we're not doing markup right now. But
Yeah,
sorry, your
Right,
suggestion.
so.
Sorry, I can save
No,
that kind of.
That's okay, but no, it's fine, we're catching it on the fly. It takes a village to write a bill, so.
Fair enough.
So thanks for that, and let's just flag it for the time. We will, so just procedurally, we'll do a committee, a series of amendments to the bill, and in order to make it create the most readable end result, we'll do a strike all.
Okay.
So then that way we don't have instances of amendment with you're reporting out, there's a change here, there's a change there, a change there,
Gotcha.
which is pretty hard to follow, especially on the floor. We'll just create one in the final version, and it's referred to as a strike all, just in case when you start hearing people talk about the amendment, that's what we're up to that.
Me.
Thank you, sorry.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
All right, so line 17, by rule or order, the commission shall adopt annually the cost per clean heat credit to be paid to the default delivery agent by an obligated party that chooses this option. In adjusting the default delivery agent credit cost, the PUC shall consider the default delivery agent's anticipated costs to deliver clean heat measures and costs borne by customers, among other factors determined by the commission. Changes to the cost of credit shall take effect not less than 180 days after adoption. So this is giving a 6-month lead time on what the credit prices are going to be. In theory, they're potentially going to be higher than the other market credits potentially. So it's to give people a heads up if they're going to be purchasing from the default delivery agent, or if they're going to be looking at the general market to see if they're going to purchase credits. All funds received from non-compliance payments pursuant to G2 shall be used by the default delivery agent to provide clean heat measures to customers with low income. So, page 12, line 6, enforcement. The commission shall have the authority to enforce the requirements of this chapter and any rules or orders adopted to implement the provisions of this chapter. The commission may use its existing authority under this title. As part of the enforcement order, the commission may order penalties and injunctive relief. So penalties and injunctive relief are the PUC's primary enforcement mechanisms that exist already in Title 30. Title 30 establishes the civil penalty structure for the PUC. There is a violations of Title 30. The PUC can give a civil penalty of up to $85,000. Continuing violations are up to $42,500 for continuing violations, with an overall cap of $170,000 for a violation. They also have injunctive relief, which means if someone is operating, they can apply to the court to give an injunction to a company to say you are required to stop operating until you have complied with the provisions of this chapter.
Sir,
We might be debating this, and someone may stand up and say, move to send it to judiciary to have all these things double checked to make sure that they're compliant or ask judiciary's opinion.
So these aren't criminal penalties. So I'm not sure if the judiciary generally looks at non-criminal penalties, but I guess it's
Never
possible.
stopped the senator from standing up and asking to be sent
Sure.
to judiciary for such reasons.
Sure.
word of the wise is sufficient, so I'll get in touch with Senator Sears and say, we're working on this, please take a look. And that's section G on page 12. And anything else like that, thank you.
Line 12. The commission may order an obligated party that fails to retire the number of clean heat credits required in a given year, including the required amounts from customers with low income and moderate income, to make a non-compliance payment to the default delivery agent. The per credit amount of the non-compliance payment shall be 3 times the amount of the amount established by the PUC under subsection F for timely per credit payments to the default delivery agent. Violations, missing the deadline or missing the number of credits results in a 3 times the amount of the standard price per credit.
And for anyone who's sort of worried about the other side of what if the dealer realized towards the end of the year that they weren't gonna have enough credits after all, they can simply go to the default delivery agent or to the marketplace and make that acquisition, at the end of the year, and then they'll have satisfied that calendar year requirement.
And I would also add that on line 12, it's a may, so this is giving enforcement discretion. And so potentially, if for some reason obligated party was short a half of a credit, or, for some reason, the PUC has discretion here on this. It's not a shall. So potentially there could be some wiggle room there. Okay, number 3, any statements or other representations made by obligated parties related to the compliance with the Clean Heat Standard are subject to the Commission's enforcement authority, including the power to investigate and assess penalties under this title. All right, page 13, line 3, records. The Commission shall establish requirements for the types of records to be submitted by obligated parties, a record retention schedule for required records, and a process for verification of records and data submitted in compliance with the requirements of this chapter. Reports. There's a typo here, sort of. As used in this subsection, standing committee means the House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife. and the Senate Committees on Finance and Natural Resources and Energy. So we're gonna have to adjust the title of the House committee that the reports are gonna go to.
And we've had a discussion last week, talked with the pro temp, the follow-up with this committee and with rules, but that we may be revising them for this committee, to something a little more comprehensive and modern as an environment and energy. We might have two of them.
After the adoption of rules implementing this chapter, the commission shall submit a written report to the standing committees detailing the efforts undertaken to establish the clean heat standard pursuant to this chapter. This is one of the things I wanted to flag on the timeline. The PUC is going to be issuing many reports on the rules, which I think this committee has a lot of interest in. But this is a report right after the rules are adopted, and you may just want to consider if you need that, because the legislature will be looking at the rules.
Themselves.
Yeah, but I mean, this is just because I looked at the number of reports on the timeline and was like, wow, there's a lot of reports due.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Well, thanks for flagging. I mean, I think, so for me, like, one of the things I really want to sort of look at again as a group is what kind of reporting do we have during the development process? Again, part to look at the questions around affordability.
all right. On or before August 31st of each year following the year in which the rules are first adopted, the commission shall submit to the standing committees a written report detailing the implementation and operation of the clean heat standard. This report shall include an assessment of the equitable adoption of clean heat measures required under subsection D, along with recommendations to increase participation for households with the highest energy burden. The provisions of 2 VSA 20D expiration of reports shall not apply to this report to be made under this subsection, which that sentence just means that this report is permanent and will continue annually. All right, page 14, new section 8125, tradable clean heat credits. Credit system, so 8124 really is the section that goes through all of the big elements of the clean heat standard program. And then so section 8125 is really detailed on the credits themselves. Bless you. Credits established by rule or order, the commission shall establish or adopt a system of tradable clean heat credits that are earned by reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the delivery of clean heat measures. While credit denominations may be in simple terms for public understanding and ease of use, the underlying value shall be based on units of carbon dioxide equivalent. The system shall provide a process for the recognition, approval, and monitoring of the clean heat credits. The Department of Public Service shall perform the verification of clean heat credit claims and submit results of the verification and evaluation to the commission annually. This is the first mention of the Department of Public Service. Just wanted to flag that they will be involved in this. Credit values. Clean heat credits shall be based on the accurate and verifiable life cycle CO2e emission reductions in Vermont's thermal sector that result from the delivery of eligible clean heat measures to end-use customer locations into or in Vermont. For clean heat measures that are installed, credits will be generated for each year of the expected life of the installed measure. The annual value of the clean heat credits for installed measures in each year shall be equal to the life cycle CO2e emissions of the fuel use that is avoided in a given year because of the installation of the measure, minus the life cycle emissions of the fuel use that is used, the fuel that is used instead in that year. So there's really two types of clean heat measures. So first, we're looking at installed measures, which include weatherization efforts, as well as clean air pumps. The installed appliances that will reduce the use of fossil fuel. So for those types of measures, they will generate credits every year that they are in use, and they reduce emissions. And so I think often we think of expected life somewhere in the range of 10 years to 20 years. That is something that the tag is going to look at specifically, but this is just saying that you don't get a one-time credit from the installation of a heat pump. You get credit every year that the heat pump is in use and reducing emissions. Which is similar to how a REC works in that a solar panel generates a REC every year that it is generating power.
And that was, the question came up last year, how would you do that? Would you receive all the credits in one single sort of lump sum upfront? Following plenty of discussion, we said really, just as council had said, in the real world, you're generating them year by year, bit by bit, the credits come in the same way.
All right, page 15, line 3. For clean heat measures that are fuels, clean heat credits will be created only for the year the fuel is delivered to the end use customer. The value of clean heat credits for fuels shall be life cycle CO2e emissions of that fuel use that is avoided, minus the life cycle CO2e emissions of the fuel that is used instead. List of eligible measures. Oh, sorry.
Well, so there's a little bit of a change here. The timing, the event that times the whole thing is delivery. We don't know when someone's going to burn it, and it will straddle calendar years, probably fairly likely. So it's just simplified accounting. When it gets delivered, that's when you get the credit.
Right, and those are one-time credits because the fuel can only be burned once. All right, page 15, line 8. List of eligible measures. Eligible clean heat measures delivered to or installed in Vermont shall include. And just as a reminder, the word include when used in statute means including and but not limited to. So it's not exclusive. Thermal energy efficiency improvements and weatherization. Cold climate air, ground source, and other heat pumps, including district, network, grid, microgrid, and building geothermal systems. Heat pump water heaters, controlled electric water heaters, solar hot water heaters, electric appliances providing thermal end uses, renewable electricity systems paired with heat pumps or electric appliances providing thermal end uses, including on-site and community-scale renewable electricity systems, advanced wood heating, non-combustion or renewable energy-based district heating services, the supply of sustainably sourced biofuels, and the supply of green hydrogen. So I'll just say quickly that last year the list was shorter, and I think there was concern that the list was exhaustive, and so the list is longer this year to reflect that there are potentially many types of measures that could be installed that would generate credits.
Sarah Watson.
Line 16, electric appliances providing thermal end uses. Can you just give me some examples of what is intended there? Let me back up to say, by that phrase, in my mind, that includes refrigerators. It's a thermal end use. Or stoves.
Is it like Vermont heaters? That's kind of what
Yeah, I don't know if refrigerators, domestic use.
I'm just flagging that phrase as one that it's not super clear to me.
Sure, I agree that it's vague. I was thinking electric heaters specifically, but I see your point.
Like an oven.
Yes, cooking appliances like oven, I think potentially are subject to this, yes. I don't know about refrigerators, but
It's thermal, but in the other direction.
yeah.
Anyway, sorry, just thank you. That's all.
Well, if it's flagged on my copy.
Someone out there has additional language that could be used, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Clarifying language.
Yeah. Well, I have the same one, for me, one of those phrases is controlled electric hot water heaters, or Yeah, like the large, it's like, well, I'm not aware of any uncontrolled. Electric car use. So I'm not, the word controlled could mean more than one thing. Thanks. Any other terms feel a little fuzzy that we may want to either further specify or at least make sure we know, we have clear intent for an example for each?
Green hydrogen. I mean, I think that's,
Hydrogen generated by a renewable source.
I might say that. Well, not even this. but-
We do, yeah, we can say that.
Yeah.
But that's not what I were gonna say.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
We had that.
I think there's some other fuzzy words on this list too.
So, yeah, and I want to make sure that I don't want to skate past anything that leaves anyone feeling like, oh, there's a question, what do we mean for that? So, in other words, I'm encouraging if you, any kind of question so that we flag it down for ourselves and make sure we have a clear picture of what's intended.
And just to add, on the next page, we're gonna talk about in order to get credit for something on this list, you're gonna have to go to the tag, and the tag is going to verify that it is something that's going to reduce emissions.
The other, as council mentioned, the list is longer than the prior version. And, you know, so for me, the important point really is that we're not trying to predict what the market's going to do. We're trying to enable the market, and we know that's a very fast-moving sector. People are coming up with new ways of doing all sorts of things on a weekly basis. So it is, as council pointed out, an include where we're just laying out examples. We know other things will come up, and that's the beauty of having the tag, which will be an expert group capable of looking at new measures and then assigning them the appropriate values for earning clean credits, for instance.
There are reasons to not be too specific.
Right, I think there's, the ultimate backstop is that the tag is going to bear down on each of these terms. I mean, so that's why they're examples more than legal definitions. It's like opening the field to examine that and more, as opposed to we have to prescribe something here that's going to rule a particular appliance or something in or out. But it's a good question.
All right, page 16, line 3, renewable natural gas. For pipeline renewable natural gas and other renewably generated natural gas substitutes to be eligible, an obligated party shall purchase renewable natural gas and its associated renewable attributes and demonstrate that it has secured a contractual pathway for the physical delivery of the gas from the point of injection into the pipeline to the obligated party's delivery system. This really is just acknowledging the fact that when you buy gas, you can't guarantee which molecules go to which house. So this is just requiring that if you're going the renewable natural gas route, there needs to be a clear contractual pathway of that you have purchased the gas, you have retained the RECs associated with it, and you have a contractual path to the homes on your system. Okay, so line 9, this is one of the new big concepts in this bill, carbon intensity of fuels. To be eligible as a clean heat measure, a liquid or gaseous clean heat measure shall have a carbon intensity value as follows: below 80 in 2025, below 60 in 2030, and below 20 in 2050, provided that the commission may allow liquid and gaseous clean heat measures with carbon intensity greater than 20, if excluding them would be impractical based on the characteristics of Vermont's buildings, the workforce available in Vermont to deliver low carbon intensity clean heat measures, cost, or the effective administration of the clean heat standard, which is just to say 2050 is a long way away and 20 is a fairly low in carbon intensity value, so that may need to be revised by then. So I'll just read, there's one, well, I'll stop, there's more to this section. So, should I keep going and then we can talk about this?
Sure.
Okay, so on page 17, there's a few more details. So the commission shall establish and publish the rate at which carbon intensity values shall decrease annually for liquid and gaseous clean heat measures consistent with subdivision 1. On or before January 2025, for 2025 to 2030, and on or before January 1, 2030, for 2031 to 2050. For the purposes of this section, carbon intensity values shall be understood relative to number 2 fuel oil delivered into or in Vermont in 2022 as having a carbon intensity value of 100. Carbon intensity values shall be measured based on fuel pathways. So that is sort of setting the baseline that as of 2022, standard fuel oil had a carbon intensity of 100. And so looking back at what's on page 16, starting in 2025, liquid and gaseous biofuels need to have a carbon intensity of below 80 in order to qualify for clean heat measures. I kind of just want to flag that I want to make sure that 2025 is the right year. I think this was proposed. The program itself is going to start in 2026. Clean heat, early credits start in 2023. I think the 2025, 2030, and 2050 are sort of tied to the Global Warming Solutions Act goals. So I think that makes sense logically, but just from like an actual practical date value, you may want to just consider 2025 as the right starting date, but I don't actually have an opinion on that.
You mean, so for instance, line 12 on page 16.
Yep.
Might be below 80 in 2026.
Yeah, but
Is that the first year of operation?
yeah, it just depends.
Yeah.
I think because you do want to think about the early action credits. So technically it actually could be 2023.
Uh-huh.
So
Oh, right.
So it could be
Yeah.
earlier or it could be later. And I just wanted to flag that. I don't think this is inherently an issue, but it's just something to know.
Something to think about, yeah. Like what would qualify now? So that would suggest if it was 2023, that you could deliver biofuels now, earn credits on biofuels and bank those as well. Okay, interesting. Thought about that before.
So overall, though, this is a new concept from last year's draft. And it's setting a pretty rigorous schedule, I think, of reducing the carbon intensity values of biofuels.
So why we ended up going this route, I think one of the things that's been very helpful in the res is it laid out numbers and then it spelled out increments. And although we're not spelling out all the increments for the carbon reductions here explicitly, we're talking about from the fuel side a reduction schedule. So it creates predictability for people who are operating in the industry, and predictability is usually part of helping make a transition cost effective or cost efficient. People will know it's coming. If you're considering changing a heating appliance and you can see that there's a new threshold, you might just be looking ahead and saying it's better to make a change now rather than, for instance.
And I just want to flag that I think you should have an expert in this talk to you about it, because I don't know the details of how much blending is required for each step.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels to me like below 80 would be like a 20 biofuel blend.
So
I'm not certain, so
Yeah.
I think that you should hear how that would work practically.
Right, and I think also for folks, I think the 80% threshold is what the carbon intensity of natural gas is, correct?
Oh, okay.
My understanding, but I agree, it would be nice to, thank you, for sure, go through these numbers carefully, and so we're doing exactly what we intend. We fully understand what we intend. I had another question about the 2022 over on page 17, line 7. I'm just wondering if it, I mean, 2022 feels a little odd, and then it's a year before the rulemaking even begins, and I don't know that someone, it's almost like you would need, this will sound silly, making it, but that you would need fuel from 2022 to test and then assign the carbon value to, and say, okay, now we have our baseline measure, and then we're gonna work from there. So I'm just wondering if we want to use a year that is part of the process, but council's wondering why, so.
Well, I think I understand your practical concern, but my practical concern is that this was written in 2022.
Yeah.
And I can't project what fuel value would be in 2025.
Right.
So this is a level set. I'm happy, I think, to discuss clarifying the language, but it was 2022 when I wrote this.
And I was only thinking of just
Yeah.
like 2023, that's the year we're passing it.
Right. That's a fair point too. We could change it this year.
Right. So we need test one in this section, and we can look carefully at those dates.
Mr. Chair, could we take a break now?
Yes, as a matter of fact, for its impression remark, and to everyone's, Jude handed me a note, 10 o'clock break, it's on our schedule. Sometimes I get so excited about the bill that I don't notice the clock.
Understandable.
So